Okay, hello and welcome to our webinar about automated deployments for Dynamics portals and marketing. My name is 𝗬𝗲𝗲𝗱𝗃𝗲𝗿, and today I would like to talk about the technical and the functional implementation for 𝗬𝗂 concepts for Dynamics portals and marketing. And of course, I would like to explain why it's important, what are the benefits, the pros and cons, but also the working principles. So why do we need to implement specific behavior for certain entities. I'm not going to talk about the tooling, I'm just talking about the working principles, because I think there are many tools available, so you can decide on your own, but then you know, okay, how to do the error analysis and how to proceed in case of any errors. We'll have 20 to 30 minutes of content, and then we have enough time for Q&A at the end of the session. So feel free to ask your questions at the end of the session. And yeah, what else? At our last webinar, we had a lot of feedback, so thank you for that. And we will try to give you enough time to ask your questions. So we will not close the webinar right after the content. So you will have a few minutes to think about your questions. So we have enough reserved time for that. Okay. Okay, let's take a look at the agenda for today. I would like to start with a quick introduction about myself and what we do as a company. And then the second part, a basic introduction. So what are portals? So how portals work? Okay, of course, a portal is a website, but you have different components, and in some way there's a connection between your Dynamics system and the portal. And I would like to explain you that as well. So we will start with the very basics, as everybody understands the part 3 and the part 4 of the session today. And I would like to introduce you a few important entities. So more or less, how can you configure the portal and what needs to be done to do the same thing on production, on UAT and so on. And part 3 is the 𝗖𝗂 for portals. So we'll talk about the basic use cases. So deploy a fresh portal, so create the portal, and then deploy the portal from a dev environment, a customization environment, to UAT production and so on. And of course, how to do the error analysis. So I will show you how to set up and prepare and then initial deployment. And then the more interesting fact about continuous integration. So how can you do the updates? And a few other things as well, of course, technical background, and my personal favorite, performance and implications. So if the portal is part of your 𝗬𝗂 pipeline, there are a lot of things to consider here, because portals, if you deploy a portal, it needs more time, of course. So we'll think about it as well. Then I'm going to show you a sample video, how it can be implemented. And part 4 of our session is about marketing. Of course, we cannot cover all use cases here, but I would like to give you a few examples here, and of course an introduction as well. For example, a production data versus config, and common scenarios, and one example, so the lead scrubbing model. So basically, how can we deploy the configuration of a scrubbing model from development to production without doing any steps manually? And as already mentioned, we have enough time for Q&A. Okay, a few words about myself. I'm 𝗬𝗲𝗲𝗱𝗃𝗲𝗿. I'm the owner of the company, of 𝗂𝗄 Software. We are a software company based in Austria, and we are focused on productivity software. That means we develop software to do things faster, or if the available tools are not enough. And we also do a lot of consulting. So we are focused on Dynamics CE, but also like Visual Studio integration and so on. So for example, we have a tool to do deployments and also extensions just to improve your coding quality. Okay, so the session focus for today, automated deployments of portals and marketing. So the why. But before we can answer that question, let's go back to the basic concept of 𝗬𝗂. So basically we try to avoid every manual step. So if somebody goes to production, needs to change something, that's basically wrong. So we always try to avoid anything in production, just one click and say, okay, the deployment is done. Maybe some approvals and so on. But the basic concept is, okay, we have everything within one package, we deploy it there, and we know, okay, what happens. So we have a very clean 𝗬𝗂 pipeline. And actually, it doesn't matter if you're using Azure DevOps or any other build server. This is just a container. Of course, you have some extra features like approvals and so on, but basically, this container doesn't matter. So another very great feature about 𝗬𝗂, or feature, actually it's a benefit here, traceable changes. Yeah. So usually what people do, okay, they write release guidelines and so on. So it's much better with 𝗖𝗂 because you can see at the log files, okay, what happens actually. And in case of any error, you can do the analysis and so on. And for example, if there's a mismatch between your production system and your dev system, just go to DevOps, take a look at the logs, and then you can compare the deployments. So that makes your life much easier, and of course consistency. So sometimes when people go to the production system and change something, yeah, okay, it was an urgent case, there's no documentation about it, yeah, nobody knows it, and next deployment you will lose the configuration and you have the same thing again. So this is why we do that. And of course, portals and marketing is not an exception. So this is the reason why we do that. We try to avoid manual steps in production and UAT, of course. Okay. So let's start with the basics of portals. So of course the portal is a website. So before we focus on the boxes at the top, let's take a look at the pictures here. We have two different kinds. We have the left side, so basically this one. Oops. Sorry about that. So, okay. As you can see, this is our configuration here, and this is the website. So before we think about dynamics, let's think about a website, the basic working principles. So if you're hosting a website, you need a few things for infrastructure. Of course, you need a database maybe. You need some hosting provider, so an environment where you can host your website. It could be Azure. And then you need a few technical things, yeah. Of course, you need the HTML code, you need maybe some JavaScript or client-side code, you need some styling sheets and so on. So a lot of different components. And in case of Dynamics portals, the database is Dynamics itself. So it works like this. You can configure all of your things here. So for example, you have the content here, and the content will be pushed to your hosting provider. So you configure your whole website within Azure or within Dynamics, and then basically copy it to the hosting environment. And actually that's all you need to know, yeah. So you have a few entities and you can change the configuration, and when you deploy it, the website will be updated. So of course there are a lot of different features, but this is the basic use case here. So now let's take a look at the boxes at the top here. We'll start with a website and then web pages. And if you take a closer look here, you can see it's the same entity. So we have a little hierarchy here, but it's actually simple. Yeah? So the website is the root container more or less, and then you have multiple web pages. And we will see that on the next slide. You have two different forms, information and content. Again, it's the same entity, but the first one is used for structure, more or less, for structure purposes, and the second thing is the content itself. So if you have different languages, you can provide the content in a different language, so you have multiple web pages. Yeah? So this is the basic working principle. So if you need to update something, you need to change the web page here, the content, and then publish it to the website. So this is the same procedure for basically everything here. Yeah. So when we think about 𝗖𝗂, that's all we need to do. We need to copy the entities, basically the data. Yeah. So, yeah, this isn't that difficult, but a few things need to be considered here. So let's take a closer look at the website. So just a few things. We have the language. And that's interesting. We'll see that on the next slide. There are different language entities, but we need to select the right ones. And again, different languages and different web pages. So we have some kind of hierarchy here. You have a root web page, and then you have some child web pages. The structure is very simple. You just need to know that there are two different forms to define the content. Okay, and you can see it here, web page again. So we have the information form, and we got the content here. So in this case, it's English and Dutch. So of course, you can have multiple languages and multiple web pages and so on, but this is the basic working principle here. And actually, that's all you need to know. It's the same procedure with JavaScript and templates and so on. And very interesting fact about deployment, the state. We will see that at the end of the session. We have different states, of course, but if you try to copy it one-to-one, you will get a lot of errors. So you need to know, okay, what's going on behind the scenes regarding the publishing state, because if you update a website of course, the infrastructure must do a lot of things. Yeah, you cannot see that, but of course, if you publish the website, you need to restart it and so on. So a lot of background tasks, and this is why we need to consider that, because the publishing state basically means, okay, what's going on behind the scenes. Okay. And as I already mentioned, yeah, we have a few languages here. So this round, and this could be confusing. Okay, it's called language, but it's not used for our use case here. So what we need is the website language and the portal language. Both are needed for that, yeah. And maybe a quick hint, you can see it here. If you deploy a portal from one environment to another environment, you have a lot of predefined entities. So for example, if you install a portal, you will get a lot of entities like web pages and so on, but also languages. And I remember that there was a time when the IDs were different, but now it looks like they are identical. So take a look at them, because if you just copy the data, you will get invalid states. So make sure that if you have the same IDs, otherwise you have to delete it first and then you can copy it again. But again, let's focus on those entities and forget about this one. Okay, CI/CD for portals. So I'm going to explain, okay, what needs to be done to deploy the portals. And I would like to give you a few hints, because sometimes, as I already said, yeah, the states complex, so you have to consider that you have to stop some stuff and then you can start it again, but I'm going to show you that as well. So before we can start talking about deployments, let's talk about the setup. So what we need to do is, if we don't have a portal, so let's assume we have two different environments, dev and production. So in both cases, we have to go to the Power Apps portal and create a new portal, so new app portal. There are different ways to do the same thing, but in this case, I'll just go for a new app. And then we have to enter some data, so basically just the name and so on, and the address. And this is the first thing we need to consider for the deployment, because of course the address is different. You cannot have the same address for two different websites. So when I think about it a second time, okay, I realize we need to change the value. So we can go to both websites and change the configuration, but when we do the deployment, so we copy the data from dev to production, it will be different. So we need to change the value in some dynamic way, but we will talk about that later. Okay, so we go to the both environments, create the websites, first step. And you can see it here. In this case, 𝗬𝗲𝗏 is our example customer, example project, and it's in progress. So if you click on the button, say new portal, it's very important to check if it's already completed. Because otherwise, if you do something in the middle of the process, you have an unstable state and you don't actually know what's going on. So click on the portal, check the current state. And actually, it's not fast. So don't do that during the working hours, because you will stop or you will block a lot of people working with the environment. Of course, not in production, but maybe developers. So try to do that outside of the working hours, because it takes some time. We will see that on the next slide. So if we take a look at the first picture, so when you go to the system and say, okay, a new portal, a new app portal, and you create it, you will get something like this. And it looks like it's fine because we have our website and so on. We have a lot of stuff here, but it's totally different, because what we need actually is something like this. So we have much more entities than on the left picture. And this is very important to understand, because if you start to do some things, some changes during the initial deployment, as I already said, you will get an unstable state. So try to get all of those entities, and of course you can check the list, but there's an easier way for that. You can just check the import job. So we can see it here, and again, this is what you can see if you check the current state of the apps. It's still in progress, but behind the scenes, if you check for the import entity, and this is basically the solution import. If you create a new portal, you will get a lot of new solutions. You can see it here. All of those are related to portals. So when you start to click create portal, it will start the import process, and you can see it here until there. So a lot of time, so it's approximately 35 minutes. And during that time, you're blocking a lot of users, as I said. So really keep that in mind. And actually, that's the same thing for marketing, by the way. So if you do that, just click on it and make sure that nobody is using the system. I think this is very important, just make an announcement or something. Yeah. I just want to let you know that it takes some time. Yeah. Okay. Next step here. So before we go into the details, I would like to introduce you to the process. So now we have our two environments. So we have two portals, on dev and on production. And now we need to deploy the first time. So we go to our dev system and make some changes. We create new content, new pages, and so on. But production is still untouched. So don't create any content on production. Just go to dev environment and do that. And this is the first step. We prepare our values. So for example, the actual URL of the system, so the primary domain name, we need to change it. So we need to prepare some values because otherwise we cannot deploy. And then we need to identify the entity. And just to give you a hint here, I think it's more than 30 or 40, something like this. I will show you the list. Yeah. And then we need to export the entities. Of course, we need to export a lot of entities from the dev environment. This is basically, okay, copy the data. And as you can see, there are two different import steps. This is very important because we do have a lot of circle dependencies. So we need to find some way to resolve this. And one approach is, okay, import the entities and then create a second import step and import it again, but just the related value so we can resolve the circle dependencies. Okay, looks good so far. Let's take a closer look at the details. Environment specific. So that basically means, okay, the value is different. So if, for example, in this case, we have the primary domain name. So this one on our dev system. Unfortunately, we don't have a value here, so I'm sorry for that. But what we need to do is we need to define the address. And here we need to define a value for int or production or whatever. So the value is different. You can see it on the second entity as well. In this case, the binding. It's not very important to have a different binding, but it's easier to identify components if there's some issues. So in this case, we have _dev and then we have _int. So the value is different. And maybe a quick hint, yeah, when you're in a customer project, always ask the customer, okay, to make sure they have the domain name ready, because in enterprise environments, it takes some time in those cases. So it's a very good advice to ask for the domain name for the production system. Okay, and maybe one more thing, in this case, it's just an example, there are much more entities like this, but in this case, we have the website and the binding. So both of them are needed, additional entities as well, as I already said, but for the website, it's just the primary domain name and the bindings, yeah, name and site name, those are just attributes. And by the way, I'm still using the legacy wording because this is a very technical focused thing, so please apologize if you're not saying table or column or something, but of course it means the same thing. Okay. Identify the entity list. So what I would like to show you here is a list. It's not necessary to read the full list here. I just want to show you, okay, how many entities do we have? So most of them are ADX underscore, so it's publisher prefix. And two of them are very important, as I already said. So in this case, the website and the web page. And as you know, okay, we have a lot of different attributes, and sometimes the behavior should be different. Of course, the primary goal is, okay, keep the data the same, so just static. We don't want to change anything, so we don't want to change anything in production. But in some cases, we need different values, as I already said. So, for example, primary domain name, this one, you can see it here, it's set to environment specific. So that just means, okay, the value must be different. So you need to predefine the value. And another very interesting thing is the hierarchy. So in this case, it's parent page. That means, as I said, we have multiple web pages, and you have a parent page and child page and so on. So during the import process, you need to find the right order, because of course you cannot import the parent page, or you cannot import the child pages without the parent page. It's not possible, so it must be the other way around. And in this case, you have a hierarchy with multiple nodes. So we see it here. So in this case, home. And under the home page, we have two child pages, but also we have single pages like home page for English and for another language. So you have multiple hierarchies. Of course, in a real world case, it's much more complex, but you can see it's the same structure. Yeah? So you have a hierarchy and you have multiple root nodes. And the same thing is here. So if you take a look at the table here, you can see it. The parent page is empty in this case. But you have a lot of other pages as well with the parent page, and this is why we need to set the parent page as a hierarchy, just for the input behavior. Okay. Export entities. And this is just a quick example, yeah, just to give you some numbers there. Of course, you don't need to read the full details here, but you can see it. If you take a look at those values, there are a lot of entities. So I think it's more than 1,000 or something, yeah. And by the way, this is an example from a very basic greenfield portal, yeah. So no additional entities, just a very basic runs. So you need to export a lot of stuff and you need to import it again. So it takes some time. And you can see it here in this case, it was 11 seconds. This was very fast, yeah, just an import process. And if you think about the ICD, of course, you need to export it from dev. This must be done just once, but the import process is complicated and you have to do it multiple times for all of our environments. Yeah. And again, in this case, we have a second export. This is related to the circle dependencies. So we mentioned, okay, we just export the first thing, store it somewhere without the circle dependency attributes. So for example, if you have two entities and both are depending on each other, you just export one entity and leave the attribute with the circle dependency zero or null or whatever, yeah. And then the second export step, and then you just include the attributes to set the relation between both. So this is one example how it can be done. Okay, and a very important thing when you need to export data, there are a lot of specific entities like website, web page, and so on, but there are also a lot of common entities like annotation. And if you have a huge system with a lot of data and so on, and different models and different applications, the annotation entity will be used in a lot of places. So if you export the annotation entity without a filter, you will get a lot of unnecessary stuff. And basically, you will import your development data to production. So it's very important to set a filter here. And you can see it in this case. What we have done here is we exported the annotation entity, but just those which are related to a specific set of entities. So in this case, for example, EDX _ access control rule and so on, and state. So we have a lot of entities here. So now we can make sure that we only export or import to production the necessary entities and not the development data. And another important thing, if you remember the list, there are a lot of entities. And of course, it's a good recommendation to create some kind of template or some code or whatever to export and move the data. But when you do that, from time to time, you have to make sure that all the entities are still up to date, because from time to time, of course, the product or this part of Dynamics is still improving. So sometimes entities will be removed or will be set to legacy and so on. And for example, in this case, shortcut. And that could be the reason because the entity is in the legacy state, so it's removed, or you're missing some models, some solutions and so on. So you need to make sure that you have on both systems or in every system the same version of your solutions. This is very important because otherwise you will get something like this. So from time to time, update your templates, and the same thing here, just a different format. And again, it doesn't mean that the entities does not exist anymore. It just says, okay, the attributes are not there, the entities are not there. Either you need to install it or you need to update your templates. Both cases are valid. Okay. Then the import part. So I would like to show you a quick example here. In this case, we have our entity, the portal language. Let's focus on this one first. Very simple, as always, just a few attributes, you just need to import it, and you can ignore some of them. So a very common example is the own ID. When it comes to the ICD, always ignore the own ID. It's useless, and in most cases it doesn't exist anyway, because if you have some users on your test system and you have the same users on your production system, the IDs are different. So either you need to adjust the data in some way, or just leave it blank, and the new owner of the entity is then the deployment user. You can also use impersonation, but this is a different story. Yeah. So the general recommendation is just to ignore their own ID because you don't need it. Yeah. And the rest of the data here is fine. So it's the same thing for this one. In this case, some site settings, and as you can see it here, the process is actually simple. You just import the entities, but there's another interesting thing. We call it specific behavior. I'm sorry, let me try to that. Okay. So what we do here is, it's called apply entity specific post behavior. So we have a pre-behavior and a post behavior. And that means you need to adjust the data in some way. That could be, for example, okay, change the values to some environment-specific values, or change the state and change it back. So, for example, if you need to import a website and it's already live, it makes sense to import it as a disabled or as a draft state, and then import it again, activate it again. Sometimes it's necessary, sometimes that's the recommendation. It really depends on the use case. But there are a few use cases where it's not possible to import it directly. So you need to adjust the state, and then after the deployment, you can just set it back. But of course, this should be part of your CI/CD deployment as well. So you need to consider these things as well. And yeah, I think the white box is just another web page entity, and we get a lot of things here. Okay, import part one. And now the interesting part. I told you, okay, we need two parts because we need to resolve the circle dependency, sorry. You can see it here, two parts, and okay, we can ignore those. And this one is the web page again. So this is the second part. In this case, we don't have a value here, but this is one approach, or actually how it can be implemented. You set the values to ignore, import it, and then apply a second import again, but then set the values. So this is the basic concept. Yeah, it's very straightforward, so you don't need to implement any special thing. Just split the import process in two parts, and that's it. Okay, so the first use case was actually very simple. Yeah, we don't need to do anything. We just need to export the data, import it, and maybe adjust some values. But when it comes to updates, you need to think about a lot of things. Yeah? And again, our main goal is we don't want to change anything in production because everything should be done by our pipeline. So when we update a web page, we need to make sure that we do not overwrite anything. Because if you have your system, of course, you have the configuration data and the production data. We'll talk about this same concept in a few slides, but for now, you have production and configuration data. And if you export production data from your demo system, you will overwrite something on the production system, or you will create a mess. Yeah? Both cases got bad. Yeah? So always try to focus on the configuration data. So for example, web pages and so on, but no contacts, no accounts and so on. So do not include any production data. Yeah? And a very interesting thing here, check for disabled entities. So this is actually very easy. Yeah? Sometimes when people try to implement a deployment strategy, they say, okay, disabled entities are not necessary, we don't need them. Well, if you have multiple web pages and for some reason you would like to disable a web page because it's not used anymore, you need to deploy the change as well, because you will disable the entity on your dev system. And if you ignore disabled entities, you won't get the change on production. So you need to make sure that to update the web pages on production as well. But this is easy, you just need to include the state, yeah, and do not set a filter for disabled entities. Quite simple. The second case is a little bit more complicated because you need to check for deleted entities. So if you delete an entity on your dev system, you cannot export it anymore because it doesn't exist. This is actually the fact, yeah. So there are different approaches to do that. Of course, you can make some data checks. If the entity exists on production, you need to delete it and so on, or you create some plugin and create some kind of state list or whatever. There are different strategies, yeah, but you need to think about it and not just ignore it, okay? And I already said I do not overwrite production data, and a very good approach is delta checks. So based on the modified on date time stamp, you will see, okay, there was a change or there wasn't a change. Because as I already said, you have so many entities and it takes a lot of time to execute the deployment. It totally makes sense to try to improve the performance. We will talk about that on the performance and implications, but for now, think about delta checks. It's quite easy, but a great benefit. Yeah. Okay. Here's just a quick example. We have our different states here. So in this case, it's a site setting. What you can do is you can check for the attributes. So if the state codes are there, and then just remove it. That could be a pre-step. So before you import the entity, check the states, remove them, or set it to disabled, and then enable it again. Very quick, very straightforward. Yeah. And a few examples for the web page. You can import as active, then set it to disabled. This could be the case if you have disabled pages or draft on your dev system and you need to deploy, but you don't want to publish it yet. So this could be the case, yeah. And hierarchies and so on, we mentioned that. Site settings, the same thing. So there are a lot of entities with a very specific behavior. So just try to import it on a test system and then you will realize, okay, what needs to be done for that. Okay, performance and implications, yeah. That's a very interesting thing here. If you start the execution, it takes some time. So export the entities and so on. And we have two cases here, enable delta checks and without delta checks. So let's focus on the second case first. We start it and after a while is completed, so 240 seconds. And the same thing with delta checks is 190. So it isn't that much, but if you have a lot of entities in your system, and again, this is just a basic system. Yeah, if you have a lot of adjustment and customizations, you will get higher numbers, so the difference will be higher. Yeah? So really, my recommendation is implement a delta check. That totally makes sense, yeah, and costs you just a few hours. Yeah. Okay. Now let's take a quick look at an example video. I would like to show you how it can be implemented. So. We don't need the sound here. So this is basically our deployment manager, but again, I don't want to talk about tooling. You can implement the same change with custom code as well. So what I'm doing here is we got a template, so we got a basic workspace here, and we have the templates with different entities, and we need to select our target environment. So in this case, we would like to execute the step against our dev environment. So that means we export the data. This is the first thing, and again, the second step is export the circle dependencies. Okay, let's continue watching that. Actually, the process is quite fast. Yeah? If you have your templates in place, you just need to configure the values. And in this case, it's a simplified version, so we just have to apply the changes to a few attributes. And again, in this case, okay, the portal, as I said, primary domain name, and the site settings. Yeah. But I think you can get the idea here. You have multiple entities with multiple attributes, and all of them need to be changed according to your production system, or of course UAT as well. So configure the values, then export the data. In this case, it's already prepared. So we have our template, we have our values and so on. And now we need to import the data. And of course, this should be part of your CI/CD pipeline. So usually it's like, okay, update your assemblies, update the web resources and so on, export the data, then create the solutions, export the solutions, export additional things, then define the deployment behavior, things like block user access, import the solutions, then import the data. Of course, you have to take care about the order because you cannot import data without the solutions. You need to import the solutions first, and then you can go to the thing. But I think those dependencies are very clear. Yeah. Yeah, this was a very basic use case here. So it's not a big deal, actually. You just need to think about a few things, and then you're done. Okay, let's think about the different data types for a second. And those are just examples, yeah. So now we're at the point where we talk about marketing. And of course, marketing is a big model with a lot of different functionalities and features. In this case, let's take an example for events. We have different entities, yeah. Sorry about that. Okay. In this case, we have building, room layout, and so on. And on the right side, we have configuration entities. And yeah, as a matter of fact, there is no straightforward guideline for this, because you don't know, okay, is it configuration or is it the production data? Of course, you have to decide on your own, but the recommendation is always, okay, think about it and don't just deploy everything, yeah. A very good example is always accounts. You don't need to deploy accounts to production. It should not be part of your deployment scenario. But configuration data, product catalog, website, in this case, those are very great entities and should be part of a deployment. Yeah. So let me give you another use case. Yeah. For example, you have a website and you have a registration page. So speakers can register for your event. They need to enter the details and so on. Of course, they do it in production. Yeah. So you cannot deploy data registrations, for example, speaker registrations, to production because you don't know that. Because you need to deploy your portal, your website, your marketing entities to production, and then the people are able to register for your event. So you cannot deploy the data. And this is basically the main concept of CI/CD, do not deploy production data. Yeah? And yeah, those are a little bit different. Hotel rooms and so on, you will have a lot of test data on your dev system, but you don't need it on production. Yeah? And again, a lot of common entities like list, set the filter, because the list is used in a lot of places. And if you need it, set a filter for that. This is very important. Okay, we got it here, yeah. This could be a filter, of course, it will depend on your use case. But for our marketing, it's enough to set a filter to is subscription. Because if you have a subscription, it's used in a marketing module, yeah. But of course, you can adjust your filter to your needs, yeah. And yeah, it's the same thing for portals and for marketing modules. You need to define some templates. Then you know, okay, what needs to deploy, and maybe you have some specific behaviors for certain entities. But the basic use case is always static, because we don't want to change anything, so just one-to-one copy, and that's it. Okay, marketing campaigns. As I already said, okay, we need some special import behavior sometimes. Let's focus on this one. This is a very interesting thing. The transition to live is not permitted from the current stage. If you think about marketing campaigns or in general background processes, sometimes a lot of things are going on behind the scenes. Yeah? And if you just update the data in the middle of the process, you will get an undefined state. Yeah? So this is why we need to do some things before we can import it. We'll talk about leading Scrum mods on the next page, but it's pretty the same use case. Yeah? So you need to stop the process, then you can update the data, and if it's necessary, you need to update the data. You need to set it back to live. So if you don't do that, you will get those error messages. Yeah, maybe the message is a little bit different, but the meaning is the same. Okay, so let's talk about lead scoring model. Yeah, in a lot of places, when you try to import the process or import the entities, you have to change some data. It's not just about attributes, sometimes it's a bit more complicated. So for example, in this case, we have an entity and we got a JSON there. So it's a model definition. Yeah. For those who don't know actually the process, it's okay. It's a process where you have leads and you can calculate some scores for each model. Yeah. So you define the process, the calculation rules, and so on, and then there's some background processes, and yeah, it's basically just to define some KPIs for the leads, more or less. And in this case, we have the model definition, and we got the org ID, and of course the org ID is different, so you cannot change the whole value because it's JSON, so you need to pass to JSON and replace it. And maybe the first guess would be, okay, let's just search replace and that's it. It works sometimes because the ID, of course, is unique, but there's a high risk that you will do something unexpected. So it's better to search for the org ID or pass the JSON, yeah. And of course, the org ID is a special entity, so you can, which we fit for the common data service. It's called entity. There's just one entrant, and you will one record, and you will get the ID, and you can replace it. So this is one case, yeah. And again, the state is maybe another thing, yeah, but we can talk about the state on the next slide. So when we talk about lead scoring models, there are different use cases. Let's focus on the easier use case first. So it does not exist, this one. So that could be the case for the initial deployment. We have our dev system, production system. We are done with the configuration, so everything works on dev. Now we can deploy it to production. The initial deployment, of course, there are new entities. So the transition state would be from nothing, because we got nothing, to live. So from here to live. And what we need to do is we need to change the state to going live. This is not live, this is going live, because this is basically the trigger for the system to start the model. So we cannot set it to live directly, we have to set it to going live. So just to trigger the process. Okay, then the left side is a little bit more complicated. We have 4 different cases or sub-cases from live to draft. This is, okay, we have our system already in place, and then we need to stop it for some reason, yeah. This is a little bit more complicated, but let's focus on, let's start with the easiest case, number 3. Also initial deployment, but it already exists, and we need to do some updates, but it's still in draft, so it's not live yet, even in production. This is very easy, we just need to update the values. So from draft to draft, there's nothing we need to do, we just copy the values and update the values on production, and that's it. So from draft to live. So that means we are in production, and on production our scrubbing model is in draft, and now we would like to set it to live. And this is basically the same use case as here, but instead of create operations, we have to do some updates or upserts or whatever, and set it to going live. Same use case, okay, fine. Okay, then from live to live, number 2. This is a very common use case. You're already live in production, so everything works, and now you need to stop it. And again, don't do that during the working hours. It could be a disaster. So try to do it without outside of the working hours, because you need to stop the scrubbing model, and then you need to start it again. So stop it, save the states in some file or some other storage locations, and import the data, and then set it to live again. So that means going live, yeah. So you stop it, save the states, complete the process, do additional stuff, and then set it back to going live. And another use case, or the last use case, to be honest, I've never seen that before. You're live and you would like to set it to draft. Yeah, same thing, you just need to stop it. So it's very similar to the case 2, but you just stop it, you don't save the states and leave it as it is, stopped. That's it. And again, it's stopping, not stopped, because if you set it to stop directly, you will get an error or an undefined state. Yeah. And this is the basic thing, but behind the scenes, there are a lot of other things to consider. And I think this is very useful if you have to deal with the system and something goes wrong. It doesn't matter if you use 𝗖𝗂 or a manual approach, but you will get some errors. Yeah? And I would like to show you how we can avoid the errors. So in this case, I said, okay, we need to import the data, and you don't need to understand the code here, but it means, okay, when we stop the model, how can we make sure that the model is already stopped? Because of course we can wait a few seconds, or we can check the status. Because in this case, okay, lead scoring model, we set it to draft, then we wait. Behind the scenes, there are some import jobs, some async jobs. When you stop a model, some things must be deleted and so on. So you have to wait until the jobs are completed, and then you can proceed. Yeah. So we have 2 different things. We have to wait for the status, and then we have to wait for the bulk deletion jobs. Yeah. I think there's some additional things as well that are on the slide here, but I think you can understand the idea here. So this is basically the concept, how it works. Yeah. And of course, it's a lot of work, but you can save a lot of time doing error analysis and so on when you have a full, complete CI/CD pipeline for product and marketing. So it just makes your life easier. Okay, that's it from my side so far. And please do me a favor, we got a feedback form, so it would be very nice if you can submit the feedback form. It just takes you a few minutes. My colleague Wang will just paste the link in the announcement window. Okay, and now we have some time for questions. Let me quick check that. Okay, you can see we have a lot of questions here. Okay, okay, let's start. What is the 𝗬𝗂𝗲𝗃? Okay, I'm sorry for that. We have a lot of attendees in the meetings. I'm sorry when I missed the basic concept at the beginning. The 𝗬𝗂𝗲𝗃 stands for continuous integration, continuous delivery, and that just means, okay, how can we execute automated deployment, so we don't have to export a solution, import it again to the target system, or click a button and execute the deployment, including all configurations and so on. So we just try to avoid the manual steps and configure anything in production. Yeah. This is basically why the 𝗬𝗂𝗃, but I think you can find a lot of material on the internet. Okay, online and on-premise. Well, of course, as you know, there are a lot of features and functionalities only for online. So some of the features are not available for on-premise systems, but basically moving solutions and so on is available on-premise. But in this case, portals and so on, as far as I know, is not available for on-premise. But basically for every feature on-premise, it's possible to implement a CI/CD strategy, so you don't have to do that manually. Sometimes it's a bit more complicated if you have a hybrid scenario where you have something in the cloud and something on-premise. Then you need, it depends on the direction, but you need some kind of build agents on-premise to do that, or you need to implement a web proxy or application proxy to establish the connection. So that there are different ways to do that. But in this case, marketing portals are not available as far as I know. Okay, I think there are a lot of questions. Give me a sec to think about it. Okay. Okay, we have some questions regarding SharePoint integration. Well, actually, yes, it is possible. And to be honest, I've never done it before, but maybe you have to adjust some headers, because sometimes it's not allowed. You have to use some kind of iframe or whatever, but sometimes it's not allowed to do that. But if you adjust the headers, it should be possible, but you need to try that, It's not directly related to the 𝗬𝗂𝗃, but basically should be possible, but you have to check that. Okay, regarding external providers, we got a question about external third-party integration. So yes, actually we do that. We have a few customers or projects. Most of them are in the enterprise context where it's not allowed, or there are some compliance policies, and you have to retrieve the configuration data from external database or from an external deployment system. And of course you can use this, but it depends. Of course you need to create some kind of custom provider to retrieve the data. But it doesn't matter. You need to adjust the data, of course, you retrieve it, but then you convert. I think the hardest part of the story is the converting process. So for example, if you have a SQL database and you retrieve the values, you have some integers, you have some text values and so on, strings. Okay, basic characters, that's fine, But for example, option set or entity references, that could be hard because you need to retrieve the primary attributes. So for example, if you have an entity reference, and so in this case a lookup, and you need to fill it with some data from an external system. So what we usually do is we try to retrieve the entity based on the primary attribute. So for example, in case of contact, the primary attribute name will be full name, or in case of account, it will be just name. So you can retrieve based on the value and based on the primary attribute, the entity reference, so the ID, and then you can set the value. The same case is valid for option sets, but in this case, you need to retrieve the metadata because you have numbers and the label. So an option set is basically an integer value and a label. And of course, usually the people don't handle with labels or with integer values. You need to retrieve the value based on the label. and then you can convert it and import it. Yeah, that's actually very easy, but it takes some time, and things are getting weird if you're using PowerShell, because you have to be a real pro to do the converting stuff in PowerShell. But in C# it's basically easy. Yeah. Okay. Okay, we got a question regarding WordPress. I'm sorry, I'm not an expert for WordPress, so I can't say it, but it's the same thing with SharePoint. You need to adjust the headers, HTTP headers, to make sure there are no cross-reference policies or whatever, and then it should be possible, yeah. But again, you have to check that, so I'm not an expert in this area. Okay, let me check the list here. What else? Okay, we got some questions regarding the number of deployments. So, well, yeah, I think this is a great benefit regarding 𝗖𝗂. You can deploy more often, so you don't have to prepare a lot of stuff. You just click the button and that's it. And this is actually the main goal. Yeah, we can deploy more often. You can have a nightly deployment or nightly build, and you don't need to adjust anything. So you don't have to go to the office in the middle of the night and do some post-deployment activities. And of course, the same thing is valid for pods as well. And I know, yeah, I've been in the industry for many years, so I know there are a lot of urgent cases when you cannot execute a full deployment. So you need to go to a production system and you need to adjust the values. But yeah, it's an exception. So we call it urgent exception or hotfix or whatever, and it should be an exception. Yeah. So if you deploy the next time, don't write a deployment guideline and say, hey, we have the 𝗖𝗂, but there's something, yeah, just a little thing, yeah. So this is bullshit, yeah. Just try to avoid that. If it's an urgent case, yeah, just do it once, but then make sure on the next deployment you can execute it within your 𝗖𝗂 pipeline. So if you define a lot of exceptions, you don't have any 𝗖𝗂 concepts anymore. Okay. Okay, what else? Okay. Okay, I cannot see any other questions so far. Okay, if there are no other questions, some of them are not approved yet, but of course, feel free to ask us questions, reach out on LinkedIn. We will reply within a few days. If you have any questions regarding 𝗖𝗂, regarding our products or whatever, feel free to ask us. Okay, we have a few more questions here. Okay, there's a question about 𝗖𝗂 during the initial deployment. Well, the thing is, when you import solutions, there's no official documentation about that. So if you import new solutions, so for example, you create a new portal, you will get a lot of new solutions, and actually it's not plugged. So if you try to access the system during during the import process, there's a chance they will get a response, or the application will open and so on. But if you trigger any process, you try to save some data and so on, there's no guarantee that it will work. So there's a high chance that it works partially and so on. So just try to make sure that you don't do that. So to answer the questions, yeah, this is not about those 35 entities, it's about the full system. So the import process is like a deployment. It's not down, but it's not stable. As well. So yeah, try to avoid that. What we basically do is we block the users based on the business units. So if you disable the business units, of course, excluding the administrators, you can make sure that nobody's able to access the system. So the easiest way is to disable the business units and make sure the administrators are still able to access the system. Okay, a few more questions here. yeah, 𝗬𝗂 can be used. It doesn't matter if you're using portals on marketing and so on. So all you need to do is you need to have some kind of build provider or build server like Azure DevOps to execute the deployment, and then it doesn't matter what you're actually using. So if you just use Sales, for example, and nothing else, it's also useful. And the thing is, the question, does it make sense to have a 𝗬𝗂 concept or not? If you have a small project with just 5 solutions or 3 solutions in a few entities, and you deploy just once a month here, and it takes you 1 hour, it's fine. We had a lot of discussions with customers and other partners talking about 𝗬𝗂, and it's always the same question. Okay, how much time can you save? How many time? Sorry. So let me try to explain another way. When you do error analysis after a failed deployment, it consumes some time. When you execute post-deployment activities, it consumes time. So there are a lot of tiny tasks to do. And if you take a look at them at the big picture, you will realize, okay, you're wasting a lot of time. And even if you have a very fast deployment manager, it needs some time to do documentation and so on. So there are a lot of tiny things, and just take a look at the times and you will realize 𝗬𝗂 concept makes sense. But of course, for very small projects, it doesn't make any sense. But in most of the projects, they have a lot of users and a lot of deployment tasks. So I would say yes, in most cases, it's totally fine to have a 𝗬𝗂 concept in place. Okay. Do we have another questions here? Okay, I need to wait for the approval. Okay. And by the way, if I missed some questions here, I will go through the list within the next days and to answer the questions. As long as you're not anonymous, it should be able to reach out to you and send you the answer. So I will try to answer all of them. Okay. I think we are done here. Okay, we're running out of time, but so far it looks good. So I think we can close the call. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Of course, we'll provide the recordings so you can watch the video again and ask some questions. And in the meantime, feel free to reach out. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.